John Dickinson was born in Talbot County, Maryland on November 8, 1732. He grew up in Delaware and later moved to Philadelphia, where he became a prominent lawyer, politician, and influential figure during the Revolutionary period. Dickinson authored a series of influential essays titled Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania from 1767 to 1768, which argued against the Townshend Acts and articulated colonial grievances against British policies. These letters were widely read and helped to unify colonial resistance. John Dickinson played a crucial role in drafting the Olive Branch Petition in 1775, which was a final attempt to avoid a full-scale war by appealing directly to King George III for reconciliation between the colonies and Great Britain. John Dickinson was the primary author of the first draft of the Articles of Confederation, which served as the initial governing document for the United States until the adoption of the U.S. Constitution. He participated in the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and advocated for a strong central government, while also supporting the rights of states. Although his views did not always prevail, his contributions were significant in shaping the nation's foundational principles. John Dickinson's contributions were crucial to the ideological and legislative foundations of the United States. He is remembered more by scholars and historians than by the general public, making him a key but often overlooked figure in the American Revolution. John Dickinson died on February 14, 1808. His later years were spent in relative obscurity compared to some of his more famous contemporaries. He continued to contribute to public life through his writings and by serving in various governmental roles.
Well, welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. Tonight, we're going to be talking about John Dickinson, one of the little-known founders, underrated founders in our history. One of the reasons for that is a lot of people felt like at the time he was on the wrong side of history, but really, if you look back at his record, that is not true. John Dickinson, at the time, was known as the Penman of the Revolution. In a lot of ways, he used his pen and used his writing abilities in a series of letters to the king from the colonies. And also in articles in newspapers all over the country for several years prior to the Revolution to express the colonists' grievances about taxes, about regulations, about the way they were being treated by the crown. And in a lot of ways, he was the voice of the Revolution through his pen. Very similar to how Samuel Adams or Patrick Henry were the voice of the Revolution with their oratory skills. John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson, the two of them especially, were the writers of the Revolution. And we'll get into all the different documents and letters and other things that he drafted as part of this effort. John Dickinson, throughout his early days, was a loyalist to the crown. He believed he was English. He was an Englishman. He believed he had natural rights through the British Constitution, and he felt that those rights started to get tread upon. And starting in the 1760s, he started writing about his grievances and his displeasure with the English crown treading on some of his English rights. And so as he got to be more and more well-known throughout the colonies, and as his documents and writings became more well-known and became really part of the overall revolutionary fever at the time, he became more and more famous throughout the colonies. He also, of course, represented both Delaware and Pennsylvania, was governor of both states, which is really unusual. And he represented both actually in different constitutional congresses. The first Constitutional Congress, he was the representative for Delaware. The second Constitutional Congress, he was the representative for Pennsylvania. It's a really interesting history there. And again, he was there for all of the foundational discussions, debates, and writing down of the way people were feeling at the time all the way through. He was the primary drafter of the Articles of Confederation, which was the first document that established the United States as a government. He was part of the drafting of the U.S. Constitution later on, which replaced the Articles of Confederation. But much earlier, what he became famous for was the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania to the English crown. This was a series of letters that got published over 2 years, and we'll talk some detail about those letters and what were in them and why they were so revolutionary, and why the thought really captured what the colonists were thinking across all 13 colonies. So let's go ahead and get into some history about John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution. So John Dickinson was one of the influential political thinkers and writers of the American Revolution. His letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania to the inhabitants of the British Colonies of 1768 set out the colonial argument for opposing British taxation more clearly and persuasively than any previous work at the time. A staunch advocate of the British Constitution, he forcefully opposed independence in July 1776 as a member of the Continental Congress. And as I said before, this is one of the reasons why a lot of people think he's not one of the more famous founders, because at the time he was not for independence. Nevertheless, he chose to fight in the Continental Army after independence was declared. So he was a true patriot, and even though he lost that argument, he did jump on board and get with the rest of the founders. Dickinson was also a member of the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and argued unsuccessfully for the supremacy of the natural legislature over the other branches of government. Yet he urged ratification of the final document. Dickinson was born November 8, 1732, at his family's plantation on Maryland's eastern shore. In 1741, the Dickinsons moved to Delaware, where he was educated by tutors at home. He began to study law in 1750, first in Philadelphia with a prominent attorney, and then he moved over to London at the Middle Temple, where he entered in 1754, and he was admitted to the London Bar in 1757. After that, he then returned to Philadelphia to practice law. Dickinson's political career began in 1759 when he was elected Delaware's provincial legislature. He became its speaker only a year later. Dickinson was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly in 1762, just 3 years later, where he became embroiled in disputes with Benjamin Franklin and others who opposed the Penn family's proprietary rights over the colony. In 1765, he became active in imperial politics as an advocate of colonial rights within the British Empire, publishing a pamphlet against the Sugar Act of 1764. As an impractical measure, and more importantly, as a delegate to the Stamp Act Congress, where he drafted its Declaration of Rights and Grievances, as well as his petitions to the King and Parliament. In them, he acknowledged Parliament's sovereignty over the colonies, but claimed that taxation without representation was a violation of their British constitutional rights. Dickinson became famous on both sides of the Atlantic in 1768, with his most famous writings of all, and that was the publication of his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, the most influential pamphlet of the Revolutionary period. In letters, he impressively laid out the case that Parliament could legislate to the colonies, which included regulation of trade, but it had no constitutional authority to tax them and to raise revenue on the colonies. Moreover, he argued that any such unconstitutional measures, like the Townshend Duties, would be most effectively opposed by not importing or purchasing British goods. Violence was unacceptable and, more to the point, fruitless as a means of obtaining redress. So he was very against violence. He was for boycotting British goods, and that was the way he felt that the colonists could get back at England and get the message across that they did not appreciate being taxed. Inherent in the letters is Dickinson's fundamental adherence to the orthodox view of the British Constitution that emerged from the revolutionary settlement of 1688 and 89 and was shaped during Sir Robert Walpole's long term as Prime Minister, one shared by a number of contemporaries such as Peyton Randolph. Dickinson and his constitutional compatriots had little patience for arguments based on claims to abstract natural rights or first principles. Relying heavily on David Hume and rejecting John Locke, Dickinson posited the British Constitution as the product of England's particular political history, and which, while not within its laws, was proven by experience to be the best form of government for the preservation of liberty. So you can see his whole idea was not like the other founders, that our rights came from God and our rights came from natural law, but he felt that our rights came from the Constitution itself. And so he really went down the law track, not the natural rights track. The letters proved wildly popular in the colonies and in Britain and was published by far away as Paris and Amsterdam. A Boston merchant, William Parfrey, described to a friend in England as justly esteemed into the whole continent to the strength of reason and argument, the thorough knowledge of the British Constitution and rights of mankind which they contain. So this was high praise for his letters. The Boston Sons of Liberty sent a copy to John Wilkes proclaiming his sentiments are ours. George Washington purchased the letters in Williamsburg at the same time that he led fellow Virginians in establishing a non-importation association to protest the Townshend Duties. Through the letters, Dickinson became universally acknowledged as the leader of American political thought, just as non-importation was adopted across the colonies as the preferred tactic of protest. In 1768, he also authored the Liberty Song, which soon had colonists up and down the Atlantic seaboard singing, "By united we stand, by dividing we fall." So you can see, not only was he writing these incredible letters at the time that really explained how the colonists were feeling, but he wrote this really catchy song that became the song of the Revolution. While Dickinson was most prominent defender of American constitutional liberties, he had no patience for destructive measures or discussions of independence. He opposed the Tea Act of 1773 and the Coercive Acts of 1774 on constitutional grounds only, but he had little sympathy for the radical Bostonians who resorted to violence. As a delegate to the First Continental Congress, he pushed for clear statements that colonial rights in its petitions to the King and Parliament and direct action in the form of a continental non-importation association. But he also advocated for the colonies to maintain a conciliatory posture towards the king. In October 1774, just after Congress ended, he wrote to a friend in London to congratulate him on the hearty union of all America. If it be possible, the return of the members into the several colonies will make the people still more firm. Nevertheless, Dickinson believed that all was not beyond repair because everything may yet be attributed to the misrepresentations and mistakes of ministers, and universal peace be established throughout the British world, only to be a general acknowledgement of this truth. Even after the battles of Lexington and Concord, Dickinson retained his hope for reconciliation with England. In the Second Continental Congress, he substantively rewrote Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of the Causes of Necessary of Taking Up Arms because he thought its language too harsh, and persuaded his fellow delegates to submit the Olive Branch petition to the king, which he wrote. And this was his final effort to avoid all-out war between the colonies and England. Dickinson's insistence on reconciliation destroyed his political standing with the radicals in Congress, such as John Adams and Jefferson, who called Dickinson's constitutional views an unacceptable halfway house. His final act in Congress was a mark not only of his consistency, but also his strength of his convictions. He vigorously spoke out against independence on July 1st, 1776, the final day of debate. When independence was adopted the next day, Dickinson, a constitutional loyalist, but still an American patriot, left Congress to join the Continental Army and fight on behalf of the colonies. So you can see he lost this argument in this Continental Congress. He did not want war. He wanted to stay conciliatory, but when it was declared, he quit Congress and went directly and joined the army to fight on behalf of the colony. Dickinson then returned to Congress after the war and was elected governor in Delaware in 1781. Then he became governor of Pennsylvania in 1782, a year later. So he was a governor of both states. In 1783, he helped Benjamin Rush establish Dickinson College in his name in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which was the first college chartered in the United States, and gave the school its motto, Tutte Libertas, which was bulwark of liberty. In 1787, Delaware selected Dickinson to represent it in the convention meeting in Pennsylvania to revise the Articles of Confederation, which he had written. There he returned to principles that had always guided his constitutional thought, imploring his fellow delegates to let experience be their sole guide, for it was experience that proved the effectiveness of the British Constitution, upon which they would model their efforts. He argued for a weak executive and an independent judiciary, and a supreme legislature that could not be overruled by either. Few of his ideas directly made it into the United States Constitution, but he nevertheless campaigned for its adoption. His 9 Fabius letters helped Delaware and Pennsylvania become the first and second states, respectively, to ratify the Constitution. His participation in the drafting and ratification of the Constitution was the end of Dickinson's active involvement in national affairs. He retired to Delaware after that, where he helped with the state's own constitution, and briefly served as state senator. He did speak out against the Jay Treaty with Britain in 1795, and he wrote more Fabius letters in 1797 to convince Americans to avoid war with France. And astonished by Napoleon's thirst for power at the time, he really believed we could be conciliatory. In the early 1800s, advocated a naval alliance with Britain against Napoleon at the time. He died in Wilmington, Delaware on February 14th, 1808. So you can see really an incredible man. Amazing contributions to all the debates that were going on at the time, was really the pen of the Revolution. Lost some of his debates in the Continental Congress, who were very war hungry. And he was much more of a pacifist and believed that we should always seek the non-war route. But when he lost that debate in Congress, he did go and join the Continental Army and became a captain and defended the colonies at that time. And you can see all the way through in all the different positions he was awarded by the people, whether it was governor of Delaware, governor of Pennsylvania, the representative of both states to the Continental Congresses, and all of the different writings he did through the years. And by the way, he was also a fantastic orator as well. So very rare skills that he had, both a great writer and a great debater, which Thomas Jefferson was not. He was more of a writer. You saw that he ran up against some of the major war hawks in the congregation at the time, and that was John Adams, that was George Washington, that was Thomas Jefferson, that was Alexander Hamilton. All of them believed that the only path here was independence. And you'll see a little clip of that here in a little bit, where we'll show how he was debating against the others in creating his Olive Branch Petition, which was the last attempt to avoid war. In terms of the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, they were a series of essays written by John Dickinson, who was a Pennsylvania lawyer and legislator at the time. They were published under the name of Farmer, which was a pseudonym that he had taken. And they were done over 2 years, 1767 to 1768. The 12 letters were widely read and reprinted through the 13 colonies and were important in uniting colonists against the Townshend Acts in the run-up to the American Revolution. According to many historians, the impact of the letters on the colonies was unmatched until the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776. The success of the letters earned Dickinson considerable fame at the time. The 12 letters were written in a voice of a fictional farmer who is described as modest but learned, an American man who had a farm but was educated. And the text is laid out in a highly organized pattern along the lines of ancient rhetoric. The letters laid out a clear constitutional argument that the British Parliament had the authority to regulate colonial trade but not to raise revenue from the colonies. This view became the basis for the subsequent colonial opposition to the Townshend Acts. It was influential in the development of the colonial thinking about the relationship with Britain. The letters are noted for its mild tone and urged colonists to seek redress within the British constitutional system, not outside it. The character of the farmer, a persona built on English pastoral writings, whose American writers before Dickinson also adopted, gained a reputational independent of Dickinson and became a symbol of moral value, employed in many subsequent American political writings after Dickinson's death. In the 1760s, the constitutional framework binding Britain and its colonies was poorly defined. Many in Britain believed that all sovereignty in the British Empire was concentrated in the British Parliament itself. This view was captured by Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, which stated that there is and must always be in all forms of government a supreme, irresistible, absolute, and uncontrolled authority in which all sovereignty resides. In practice, however, the colonies and their individual legislatures had historically enjoyed significant autonomy, particularly in taxation. In the aftermath of the British victory over France in the 7 Years' War, In 1763, Britain decided to permanently station troops in North America and the West Indies. Having a specie-based currency facing a large national debt and opposition to additional taxes in England, British officials looked to their North American colonies to enable financing the upkeep of these troops and future wars. The passage of the Stamp Act of 1776, a tax on various printed materials in the colonies, ignited a dispute over the authority of British Parliament to levy internal taxes on its colonies. The Stamp Act faced opposition from American colonists who initiated a movement to boycott British goods. From British merchants affected on the boycott and from those Whig politicians in Parliament, notably William Pitt. In 1766, under the leadership of a new ministry, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. However, Parliament at the same time passed the Declaratory Act, which affirmed its authority to tax the colonies. In 1767, Parliament imposed import duties, remembered as the Townshend Acts, on a range of goods imported by the colonies. These duties reignited the debate over parliamentary authority. John Dickinson, the wealthy Philadelphia lawyer and member of Pennsylvania Assembly, took part in the Stamp Act Congress in 1765 and drafted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. In 1767, following the passage of the Townshend Acts, Dickinson sent out his letters from a farmer to clarify a constitutional question of Parliament's authority to tax the colonies and to urge the colonists to take moderate action in order to oppose Townshend Acts. The letters were first published in the Pennsylvania Chronicle and then reprinted in most newspapers throughout the colonies. The letters were also reprinted in London with a preface written by Benjamin Franklin, and in Paris and in Dublin and in Amsterdam. Though in reality Dickinson had little to do with farming in 1767, the first letter introduces the author as a farmer settled after a variety of fortunes near the banks of the River Delaware in the province of Pennsylvania. In order to explain to the reader how he acquired a greater share of knowledge in history and the laws and constitution than is generally attained by men of his class, the author informs the reader that he spends most of his time in the library of his small estate. The author then turns to a discussion of the brewing crisis between British Parliament and the colonies. While acknowledging the power of Parliament in matters concerning the whole British Empire, Dickinson argued that the colonies retain the sovereign right to tax themselves. British officials, partially on the advice of Benjamin Franklin, believed that while American colonists would not accept internal taxes levied by Parliament, such as the Stamp Act, they would accept external taxes such as import duties. However, Dickinson argued that any taxes, whether internal or external, laid upon the colonies by Parliament for the purpose of raising revenue rather than regulating trade were unconstitutional. Dickinson argued that the Townshend Acts, though nominally import duties, therefore are external taxes, and were nevertheless intended to raise revenue rather than to regulate trade. So you can see how important the writings were of John Dickinson, his letters, his other documents that he wrote, his grievances. He really was reflecting and becoming the voice of the colonists at the time through his writings. And it was incredibly important as the ramp up to the Revolutionary War was occurring. So let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of short videos, and then we will come back and talk about them on the other side.
Incredibly gifted writer, he became one of the first vocal champions of American rights. Yet, despite the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord, he was one of the last to recognize the need to break away from Great Britain and declare independence. When the Declaration of Independence was ready to be signed, he resigned from Congress rather than ascribing his name to a nation he did not believe was prepared for self-governance. Despite his critics loudly denouncing him as a loyalist, he would later earn the nickname the Penman of the Revolution for his authorship of so many documents for the First and Second Continental Congresses. He was only one of two members of the Continental Congress to actively take up arms during the Revolution. His name was John Dickinson, and it's his story we'll look at today. Welcome to America's Forgotten Founders, where we will look at people whose contributions to the American Revolution, whether on the battlefield, in the halls of power, or on the home front, have been all but forgotten by the annals of history. The man who would eventually be called the Penman of the Revolution was born on his family's tobacco plantation near the village of Trapp in Talbot County, Maryland, on November 8, 1732. His parents were Samuel and Mary Dickinson. John was born into a life of wealth and comfort. His father, Samuel, was a profitable landowner and lawyer. By the time of his death, the family would own over 9,000 acres. In 1740, Samuel, his second wife Mary, and their two sons moved to their plantation in Kent County, Delaware, named Poplar Hall. Here, John was taught how to run a plantation and manage and discipline slaves. Like the other sons of wealthy landowners, John received a good education, being taught not only by his parents, but several tutors as well. The most influential tutors were Presbyterian minister Francis Allison and the academic William Killen. Killen, who would remain a lifelong friend, especially emphasized rhetoric and writing to the young Dickinson. Despite his strong ties to Minister Allison, John was a proud third-generation Quaker. He lived and breathed his deeply held Quaker values and beliefs, which would shape his future political career. At 18, John began clerking for John Moland, a prominent attorney in Pennsylvania. Not content with his education, by 1753, John leveraged his family's connections to attend Middle Temple, a prestigious law school in London. While at Middle Temple, John developed personal and political relationships that would last a lifetime. After 3 years in the mother country, John returned home to the colonies at the end of 1756. By 1757, he was accepted to the Pennsylvania State Bar and began practicing in Philadelphia. When his father passed away in 1760, John inherited part of Poplar Hall. He would continue to manage the plantation's affairs in absentia for over a decade and a half. While in Philadelphia, John married Mary Norris, a wealthy, well-educated Quaker, on July 19, 1770. The happy couple would go on to have 5 children, though only 2, Sarah and Maria, would survive to adulthood. Living in one of the largest cities in the colonies, the young, wealthy, and well-educated Dickinson quickly took center stage as Great Britain and her American colonies increasingly came into conflict in the mid-1760s. Despite his opposition to some British policies, Dickinson was no radical. While serving as one of Pennsylvania's delegates to the Stamp Act Congress in 1765, he was quickly tapped to write their Declaration of Rights and Resolves. This declaration was the first time the American colonists expressed the sentiment that they were, quote, entitled to all the inherent rights and privileges of the king's natural-born subjects within the kingdom of Great Britain, and that one of those rights should be, quote, that no taxes should be imposed on them, but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. This document was the first official document drawn up and agreed upon by a combination of American colonies. Just 2 years later, in 1767, he published his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in protest of the Townshend Acts. In the document, despite his misgivings on no taxation without representation, Dickinson argued that Britain had the right to control and regulate trade within the empire. There is no privilege the colonies claim, which they ought, in duty and prudence, more earnestly to maintain and defend than the authority of the British Parliament to regulate the trade of all her dominions. He pleaded with his fellow colonists to seek a peaceful solution within the British constitutional system. That constitutional system, to Dickinson, protected the colonies from European aggression and allowed them the peace and prosperity they so desired. Great Britain is our advanced post or fortification, which, remaining safe, we, under its protection, enjoying peace, may diffuse the blessings of religion, science, and liberty through remote wildernesses. It is, therefore, incontestably our duty and our interests to support the strength of Great Britain. He further argued that if the colonies were to be torn from the body to which we are united by religion, liberty, laws, affections, relations, language, and commerce, that the colonies would bleed at every vein. This document was widely read in both the colonies and the mother country. In the colonies, the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania were quickly embraced by many. In Great Britain, the view was much more critical. With the exception of a few Whig newspapers, the vast majority of publications denounced the document. It should be of little surprise that the infamous Dickinson, now publicly known as the author of the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, was chosen as a delegate to the First Continental Congress. Like most of the members present, Dickinson was a moderate who, while he wanted his grievances addressed, sought reconciliation with Great Britain. To this end, he was appointed the primary author of the 1774 Petition to the King. Though this document restated and clarified the colonists' grievances with the king and with Parliament, it still ended with a statement of loyalty and fidelity. Permit us then, most gracious sovereign, in the name of all your faithful people in America, with the utmost humility, to implore you, for the honor of Almighty God, whose pure religion our enemies are undermining, for your glory, which can be advanced only by rendering your subjects happy and keeping them united, for the interests of your family depending on an adherence to the principles that enthroned it, for the safety and welfare of your kingdoms and dominions threatened with almost unavoidable dangers and distresses, that your majesty, as the loving father of your whole people, connected by the same bands of law, loyalty, faith, and blood, though dwelling in various countries, will not suffer the transcendent relation formed by these ties to be farther violated, in uncertain expectation of effects that, if attained, never can compensate for the calamities through which they must be gained. The king never formally replied. During this time, Dickinson also authored the Address to the Inhabitants of the Province of Quebec, where he sought to convince the predominantly French population to join the colonies to guarantee their rights. The address did not achieve the desired effect. At the Second Continental Congress the following year, Dickinson again headed a last-ditch effort to conclude a peaceful reconciliation between the king and the colonists by authoring the Olive Branch Petition. The document, coming several months after the battles of Lexington and Concord, nonetheless expressed a profound desire for peace with Great Britain. Attached to your majesty's person, family, and government, with all devotion that principle and affection can inspire, connected with Great Britain by the strongest ties that can unite societies, and deploring every event that tends in any degree to weaken them, we solemnly assure your majesty that we not only most ardently desire the former harmony between her and these colonies may be restored, but that a concord may be established between them upon so firm a basis as to perpetuate its blessings, uninterrupted by any future dissensions, to succeeding generations in both countries. The king never even opened the petition. By the time it arrived, the king, in the aftermath of the Battle of Bunker Hill, had issued the proclamation of rebellion on August 23rd, declaring all 13 colonies to be in open rebellion. While working on the Olive Branch Petition, Dickinson worked with John Adams on his Model Treaty, a template treaty between the new United States and foreign powers. He also extensively revised Thomas Jefferson's Declaration on the causes and necessity of taking up arms. While serving with the Second Continental Congress, Dickinson believed that conflict between the colonies and Great Britain had become inevitable. Despite his best efforts, reconciliation was now impossible. While he grudgingly accepted that independence was coming, he thought the colonies were ill-prepared for it. Dickinson argued that the new country needed a constitution to bring some semblance of unity to the new nation and spell out the duties of Congress. Dickinson made clear his position in a speech before Congress. I know that the tide of the passions and prejudices of the people at large is strongly in favor of independence. I know, too, that I have acquired a character and some popularity with them, both of which I shall risk by opposing this favorite measure. But I had rather risk both than speak or vote contrary to the dictates of my judgments and conscience. Congress agreed, and Dickinson was allowed to chair a committee that started rewriting Benjamin Franklin's draft Articles of Confederation. One of the first things Dickinson did was change the name of the new country in Franklin's draft from the United Colonies of North America to the United States of North America. Over the next few weeks, Dickinson infused Franklin's Confederation system with his own ideas and principles. Borrowing heavily from British law, he created a national legislature that held authority over the states. Drawing heavily from his religious background, the document also guaranteed civil rights at the national level and granted the federal government the sole power to make foreign policy. Before Dickinson could put the finishing touches on his version of the Articles, Congress decided to vote on whether or not to sign the Declaration of Independence. Despite his best efforts to postpone the vote, it proceeded as scheduled on August 2nd, 1776. Every delegate present except Dickinson voted yes. He, in good conscience, could not vote yes. But he also didn't want to spoil the unanimity of the vote by voting no. Forced to choose between betraying his principles or his fellow citizens, he instead resigned from Congress. While Dickinson became only one of 2 members of the Continental Congress to actively take up arms and participate in the war, the Continental Congress proceeded to gut his draft of the Articles of Confederation. The strong national legislature he proposed became instead an advisory body. The civil rights protections he enshrined at the national level disappeared entirely, and although Congress was granted permission to conduct foreign affairs, they had no means of enforcement. What exactly Dickinson did after resigning from Congress is unclear. While some sources say he fought in the Pennsylvania state militia as a private, others claim it was the Delaware state militia. Both options are undoubtedly plausible. Despite living in Philadelphia, owning Poplar Hall also made him a citizen of Delaware. Some sources claim that Dickinson served as a brigadier general in the Pennsylvania militia, the Delaware militia, or even the Continental Army. Some sources claim he was offered the commission but turned it down. At any rate, we do know he briefly served as a soldier in some capacity. By December 1776, Dickinson was living at Poplar Hall with Mary. He refused a commission as a brigadier general in the Delaware State Militia in October 1777. Despite remaining largely distant from political affairs in 1777, John Dickinson decided to begin freeing his slaves. Being the largest slaveholder in Delaware, he came under fierce criticism from some of his contemporaries. He likely decided to free his slaves due to a combination of his Quaker beliefs, revolutionary fervor, and the fact that his plantation had shifted away from more labor-intensive crops, like tobacco, to less labor-intensive ones, like wheat. It is rare for people to be driven by a single motivation. His decision to free his slaves was likely a culmination of moral, political, religious, philosophical, and economic factors. At any rate, Dickinson remains the only founding father to have freed his slaves between 1776 and 1786. While residing at Poplar Hall, Dickinson was informed that his and Mary's house near Philadelphia, Fair Hill, was burned by the British during the Battle of Germantown on October 4th, 1777. In January 1779, Dickinson returned to the Continental Congress as a delegate, this time from Delaware. During his brief tenure, he signed the much-neutered Articles of Confederation. He was elected President of Delaware on November 13, 1781, by the Delaware General Assembly. The only delegate to the Assembly that didn't vote for Dickinson was Dickinson himself. During his time as president, his proclamation against vice and immorality sought to rein in the disorders of the Revolution in Delaware. The policy proved not only popular in Delaware, but in Pennsylvania as well. Always favoring Pennsylvania over Delaware and seeing a chance to return to the limelight, John ran for and was appointed President of Pennsylvania on November 7, 1782. He actually served in both positions concurrently until he resigned from his post as President of Delaware on January 12, 1783. His time as President of Pennsylvania was difficult. The position of president was weak by design, so Dickinson was forced to collaborate with an often hostile General Assembly. He nonetheless did what he could. He successfully negotiated land disputes with Virginia in the south and Connecticut in the north. He also non-violently helped end the Pennsylvania Mutiny of 1783. His exact reasoning for taking a soft-handed approach is unknown. It has been suggested he sympathized with the soldiers' complaints. It's also possible he was unsure whether the militia he had nominal control over as president would actually act against their fellow soldiers. The mutiny was the main factor that drove Congress to replace Philadelphia as the new nation's capital and create instead a new federal district under their express control. After his term as President of Pennsylvania, Dickinson returned to Delaware. Despite angering many Delawareans by abandoning their state to serve as president in another state, Pennsylvania, he nonetheless remained a highly respected former statesman. He was appointed as a delegate to both the Annapolis Convention and the Constitutional Convention. He served as president of the Annapolis Convention. Ultimately, despite being a Democratic Republican, Dickinson favored the new Constitution, which adopted much of the framework of his earlier draft of the Articles of Confederation. Delaware became the first state to ratify the new Constitution of the United States on December 7, 1787. Despite Delaware very quickly ratifying the document, many other states were hesitant. Dickinson, under the pen name Fabius, wrote 9 essays in a bid to try and sell the new document to his countrymen. When Delaware sought to revise their 1776 Constitution in 1791, Dickinson chaired the convention. His health began to decline, and Dickinson would last serve as a state senator in 1793 before resigning at the year's end. In 1801, he published a 2-volume work on politics. John Dickinson died in Wilmington, Delaware, on February 14, 1808, aged 75. He was buried in the Friends Burial Ground. Like many of the people we have looked at in this series, John Dickinson was a man of immense contradiction. He built his fortune on the back of his slaves, yet intensely disliked that institution on both religious and political grounds, and he chose to free his slaves much earlier than any other founding father. He called for the non-violent resistance of the colonists against Great Britain and declared himself a loyal subject of the king, while later serving as a soldier against the empire in the war. He wrote the Olive Branch Petition, professing his desire for peaceful reconciliation with the crown, while co-authoring the Declaration on the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. He was an intellectually gifted man who advocated reason and logic above all else, yet remained devoted to his Quaker principles to his dying breath. But despite his beliefs, because he was an advocate for the lawfulness of defensive war, he never was allowed to join the Religious Society of Friends. Although he did not sign the Declaration of Independence, he authored more documents than anyone else on behalf of the Continental Congress. In the end, perhaps Thomas Jefferson, reflecting on Dickinson's legacy after his death, best encapsulates his contributions to the foundations of the United States. A more estimable man or truer patriot could not have left us. Among the first of the advocates for the rights of his country when assailed by Great Britain, he continued to the last, the orthodox advocate of the true principles of our new government, and his name will be consecrated in history as one of the great worthies of the Revolution.
Dickinson of Pennsylvania. One colony cannot be allowed to take its sister colonies headlong into the maelstrom of war. Parliament will be eager to call a halt to hostilities, as are we. They will seek conciliation. We must offer them an olive branch. I move this assembly consider a humble and dutiful petition be dispatched to His Majesty, one that includes a plain statement that the colony desires immediate negotiation and accommodation of these unhappy disputes, and that we are willing to enter into measures to achieve that reconciliation. Second.
Mr. Dickinson.
The time for negotiation is past. The actions of the British Army at Lexington and Concord speak plainly enough. If we wish to regain our natural-born rights as Englishmen, then we must fight for them.
I have looked for our rights in the laws of nature and can find them only in the laws of political society. I have looked for our rights in the Constitution of the English government and found them there. Our rights have been violated, Mr. Adams. That is beyond dispute. We must provide a plan to convince Parliament to restore those rights. Do we wish to become aliens to the mother country? No! No, gentlemen. We must come to terms with the mother country. No doubt the same ship which carries forth our list of grievances will bring back their redress.
Mr. Dickinson.
My wife and young children live on the main road to Boston, fewer than 5 miles from the full might of the British Empire. Should they sit and wait for Gage and his savages to rob them of their home, their possessions, their very lives? No, sir. Powder and artillery are the surest and most infallible conciliatory measures we can adopt.
If you exclude the possibility of peace, Mr. Adams, then I tell you no. You have blood on your hands.
And I tell you, Mr. Dickinson, that to hold out an olive branch to Britain is a measure of gross imbecility.
If you New England men continue to oppose our measures of reconciliation, you will leave us no choice but to break off from you entirely and carry on the opposition in our own way.
Hear, hear.
I sit in judgment on no man's religion, Mr. Dickinson. But your Quaker sensibilities do us a gross disservice, sir. It is one thing to turn the other cheek, but to lie down on the ground like a snake and crawl toward the seat of power in abject surrender. Well, that is quite another thing, sir. And I have no stomach for it, sir. No stomach at all.
We will exhaust all peaceful approaches, Mr. Adams. And we will do it with or without the approbation of you and your Boston insurrectionists.
Hear, hear. Mr. Dickinson's motion to send an olive branch petition to His Majesty has been made and seconded. We shall proceed to a vote.
New Hampshire.
So as you can see in that last video there, that incredible debate between John Dickinson and John Adams, and you had George Washington sitting there, Thomas Jefferson was there, all the great founders of our nation were there, and you can see what the debate was. The debate was really not that we as colonists had been tread upon and that our constitutional rights had been taken away. Everybody agreed on that. The disagreement was between John Dickinson, who was a Quaker, and Quakers were very peaceable people and believed in going the route of peace always and to avoid war at all costs. So Dickinson was arguing, let's do this olive branch petition as a last chance and a last attempt at avoiding war. And John Adams and his ilk in the Continental Congress were very much fed up with that and had felt like they had been doing that for many years, and that their arguments had been not heeded by the king or his parliament in London, and that the only redress here was going to be to fight for our independence and fight for our rights. And so that was the debate that was happening at that time. Actually, after that debate that you just saw, John Dickinson actually won out briefly, and they were able to send that olive branch petition to the king. Of course, he never responded to it, and the war was on. By that time, we had already had Lexington and Concord, and we had a number of other skirmishes throughout the colonies. So the die was pretty much cast, and everything that John Dickinson was writing about was true, but he lost the argument in terms of not going to war. So hopefully you enjoyed that and you learned a lot about John Dickinson. He was a fascinating man. He had tremendous contributions. Obviously had this great university dedicated to him in Pennsylvania, which was a great thing. It's a liberal arts college in Carlisle, named after him. But in terms of the contributions he made as a founder to our country, we're still wrestling with those. And you can see there's a lot to dig into when it comes to John Dickinson. If you have a chance, I'd highly recommend you read through all of his 12 letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. They're really fascinating, some of the arguments he was making. And you can see the boiling pot that was the colonies back then and why it eventually ended up in war and why we asked for our independence. So hopefully you love history as much as we do. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of great stuff coming to you on Traveling Through History. Drop us a comment sometime about a topic you'd love us to cover, and we'll do that at an episode in the future. So thank you so much and have a great night.